The dust from the stagecoach hadn't even settled when Eleanor Hartwell stepped down onto the sun-baked streets of Redemption, Arizona territory, her emerald eyes scanning the ramshackle collection of buildings that would be her new home in the summer of 1878. She was 22 years old, educated in Boston, and completely unprepared for the sight of the man leaning against the post outside the general store, his hat pulled low over his eyes, and a revolver hanging from his hip like it belonged there. He watched her with an intensity that should have made her nervous, but Eleanor had faced down professors who thought women had no place in literature, and a father who'd tried to marry her off to a banking heir, so one dusty cowboy wasn't about to rattle her composure. She lifted her chin and walked straight toward the store, her boots clicking on the wooden planks. The cowboy didn't move, blocking her path with his considerable frame. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of whiskey in lamplight. A scar cut through his left eyebrow, giving him a dangerous appearance that Eleanor suspected he cultivated deliberately. "You must be the new schoolteacher," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "I am. Miss Hartwell. Now if you'll excuse me, I need to purchase supplies." She tried to step around him, but he shifted his weight, still blocking her way, not threatening exactly but definitely making a point. "Folks around here call me Cade Morrow. I run the biggest ranch in 3 counties, and I make it my business to know everyone who comes through Redemption." His eyes traveled over her face, assessing. "You look too soft for this territory, too refined. Women like you don't last 6 months out here before they run back east." Eleanor felt something hot and defiant rise in her chest. She'd heard variations of this speech her entire life, always from men who thought they knew what she could or couldn't handle. She took a deliberate step closer to him, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze, close enough that she could see the surprise flicker across his features. "You don't scare me," she said clearly, her voice steady and sure. For a moment, Cade Morrow just stared at her, and Eleanor wondered if she'd miscalculated, if this rough cowboy might actually be the dangerous man his appearance suggested. Then slowly, deliberately, he reached up and tipped his hat, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth that transformed his entire face from threatening to something far more complicated. "Good," he said, his voice softer now, almost intimate. "That means I stay." Eleanor's heart did an unexpected flip in her chest, but she refused to let it show on her face. She stepped around him, this time meeting no resistance, and pushed through the door of the general store. Behind her, she heard him chuckle, low and warm, and she told herself the shiver that ran down her spine was just the temperature change from the brutal Arizona sun to the relative cool of the store's interior. The next morning, Eleanor stood in front of her classroom, a converted room in the back of the church, and surveyed her students. 16 children ranging from 6 to 14 stared back at her with varying degrees of curiosity and suspicion. She'd just begun writing the alphabet on the slate board when the door opened and Cade Morrow walked in, hat in hand this time, looking oddly out of place among the small desks and children's drawings pinned to the walls. "Mr. Morrow," Eleanor said, keeping her voice professionally neutral. "Is there something I can help you with?" "I'm on the school board," he said, and she detected a hint of amusement in his tone, as if he knew exactly how much this information would irritate her. "Just checking to make sure everything is satisfactory for our new teacher." Eleanor's jaw tightened, but she smiled sweetly. "Everything is perfectly satisfactory, thank you. Now if you'll excuse us, we have lessons to attend to." "Of course." He made no move to leave, instead settling himself into a chair against the back wall, his long legs stretched out in front of him. "Don't mind me, just observing." The next 2 hours were the longest of Eleanor's life. She was acutely aware of his presence, of his eyes following her every movement as she led the children through their lessons. She stumbled over a geography question she normally could have answered in her sleep, and when little Sarah Mitchell asked her to spell rhinoceros, Her mind went completely blank for several agonizing seconds. Through it all, Cade sat there, silent and watchful, his expression unreadable. When the children finally filed out for their noon recess, Eleanor turned to face him, her hands on her hips. "Was there a particular reason for that display, Mr. Morrow, or do you simply enjoy making people uncomfortable?" He stood, unfolding from the chair with the easy grace of a man completely comfortable in his own skin. "I told you, school board business. That's a lie and we both know it." The words were out before Eleanor could stop them, more confrontational than she'd intended, but she was tired of playing games. To her surprise, Cade laughed, a genuine sound that filled the small room. "You're right. I wanted to see if you were as sharp as you seemed yesterday, or if that was just bravado covering fear." He took a step closer. "Turns out you're exactly as sharp as you seemed, maybe sharper." "I'm so glad I could provide you with entertainment," Eleanor said dryly, but she felt a flutter of something in her stomach that definitely wasn't annoyance. "It wasn't entertainment, Miss Hartwell, it was respect." He settled his hat back on his head. "I'll be going now, but I'll be back." "Why?" The question escaped before Eleanor could stop it, and she immediately wished she could pull it back. Cade paused in the doorway, looking back at her over his shoulder. "Because you're interesting, and out here in the territories, interesting is hard to come by." Then he was gone, leaving Eleanor standing alone in the classroom, her heart beating entirely too fast. Over the following weeks, Cade made good on his promise. He appeared everywhere Eleanor went, his presence becoming a constant in her new life in Redemption. He was at the general store when she shopped on Saturday mornings, at the church on Sunday services, even at the small lending library housed in the postmaster's home where she borrowed books to supplement her teaching materials. He never pushed, never demanded her attention, but he was always there, watching her with those whiskey-colored eyes that seemed to see right through whatever careful facade she presented to the world. Eleanor told herself she was annoyed by his constant presence. She told herself she didn't look for him when she walked down the street, didn't feel disappointed on the rare occasions when he wasn't there. She told herself a lot of things, most of them lies. The truth revealed itself on a Tuesday afternoon in late September when a rattlesnake found its way into the schoolhouse. Eleanor heard the distinctive warning rattle from somewhere near her desk and froze, her hand outstretched toward a stack of papers. The children, bless them, had been well trained in the dangers of the desert and sat perfectly still, their eyes wide with fear. "Everyone remain calm," Eleanor said quietly, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "No one move. I'm going to walk very slowly toward the door, and then you're all going to follow me, one at a time, starting with those nearest the door." She took one careful step, then another. The rattling intensified, and she saw the snake coiled beneath her desk, its head raised, its forked tongue tasting the air. Her third step made a floorboard creak, and the snake's muscles tensed, preparing to strike. The door burst open with a bang that made everyone jump. Cade stood there, his eyes immediately finding and assessing the situation. In one fluid motion, he drew his revolver and fired, the shot deafening in the enclosed space. The snake's head exploded, its body writhing in death throes for a moment. No one moved. Then the children erupted in excited chatter, the fear breaking now that the danger had passed. Cade holstered his gun and crossed to Eleanor in 3 long strides, his hands coming up to grip her shoulders, his eyes searching her face. "Are you hurt?" His voice was rough, urgent in a way she'd never heard from him before. Eleanor shook her head, not trusting her voice. Now that the immediate danger had passed, reaction was setting in, her hands beginning to tremble. "Look at me," Cade commanded, and she did, meeting his eyes. "You're safe." "You're all right, I know," she managed. "I just thank you." His hands were still on her shoulders, warm and solid and grounding. "When I heard about the snake, when they said you were in here with it," he broke off, shaking his head, "I've never run that fast in my life." Something shifted in Eleanor's chest, some wall she'd been carefully maintaining crumbling to dust. "How did you know?" Tommy Bracken ran to find me. "Smart kid." His thumbs moved in small circles on her shoulders, probably without him even realizing it. "Eleanor." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and hearing it in his rough voice did something to her insides. "Yes, have dinner with me, at my ranch. Let me cook for you, let me—" He stopped, seeming uncharacteristically uncertain. "Let me spend time with you without the whole town watching." Eleanor knew she should say no. Knew that going to his ranch alone would be scandalous by Boston standards and even by the looser standards of the frontier. Knew that saying yes would change something between them, would be an admission of all the things she'd been denying to herself for weeks. "All right," she heard herself say. "When?" The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise over the desert, warm and bright and impossible to look away from. "Saturday. I'll pick you up at 5. Saturday arrived faster than Eleanor expected, and she found herself standing in front of the cracked mirror in her small room behind the schoolhouse, changing her dress for the 4th time. She'd finally settled on a simple green calico that matched her eyes when she heard the knock at her door. Cade stood on her small porch, hat in hand, wearing a clean shirt and looking scrubbed and nervous in a way that made Eleanor's heart squeeze. "You look beautiful," he said simply, and the sincerity in his voice made her blush. His ranch was an hour's ride outside town, and he'd brought a gentle mare for her to ride. As they traveled, Cade told her about the land, about how he'd come to Arizona 5 years ago with nothing but a horse and determination, how he'd built his ranch from the ground up, working harder than he'd ever worked in his life. "Where are you from originally?" Eleanor asked, genuinely curious. "Virginia. My family had a plantation before the war." His jaw tightened. "My father fought for the Confederacy. I was just a boy then, but old enough to understand what it was really about, old enough to be ashamed. When the war ended and everything fell apart, I was glad. I know that's a terrible thing to say, that good people suffered, but that whole system, it needed to end." Eleanor felt something warm bloom in her chest. "My father ran a station on the Underground Railroad during the war," she said quietly. "He never talked about it much, but I found some of his old journals. I was proud of him for that, even if I couldn't tell him so." Cade glanced at her, something like understanding passing between them. "You said he passed 3 years ago. My mother followed 6 months later. I think she died of a broken heart, really, though the doctors said it was pneumonia." Eleanor swallowed hard. "That's part of why I came out here. Everything in Boston reminded me of them, of what I'd lost. I needed a fresh start." "I'm sorry," Cade said, and the simple sincerity of it meant more than any elaborate condolence. His ranch, when they arrived, took Eleanor's breath away. It wasn't fancy, nothing like the grand estates back east, but it was solid and well-built and clearly maintained with pride. The house itself was adobe, keeping it cool in the brutal desert heat, with a wide porch that faced west toward the mountains. Corrals held some of the finest horses Eleanor had ever seen, and in the distance, she could see cattle dotting the landscape. "You built all this yourself?" She asked, awed. "With help," Cade admitted. "I have good ranch hands, men who work hard and who I trust, but yes, mostly myself." He helped her down from the horse, his hands spanning her waist, and for a moment they stood close enough that Eleanor could feel the heat radiating from his body. "Come inside, I promised you dinner." To Eleanor's surprise, Cade could actually cook. He'd prepared a simple meal of steak, potatoes, and vegetables from his garden, but everything was perfectly seasoned and cooked with obvious care. They ate at her rough-hewn table on the porch, watching the sun sink toward the horizon and paint the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple that seemed impossible, too vivid to be real. "Tell me about Boston," Cade said, pouring her more coffee. "Tell me what made you want to teach." So Eleanor did. She told him about her education, about the books that had been her constant companions growing up, about her belief that education was the key to changing the world. She told him about the fight she'd had with her aunt, her only remaining family, who'd wanted Eleanor to marry respectably and settle down rather than heading west to teach school. She said I was throwing my life away, Eleanor said, staring into her coffee cup. Said I'd die an old maid in some dusty frontier town with nothing to show for my life. What do you think? Cade asked quietly. Eleanor looked up, meeting his eyes. I think I'd rather die an old maid doing something meaningful than live as someone's decorative wife, hosting tea parties and pretending to be less intelligent than I am just to make my husband feel superior. Cade was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, My father used to tell my mother she talked too much, that her opinions weren't welcome at the dinner table. I watched her shrink herself for years, making herself smaller and quieter until sometimes I felt like she was barely there at all. His hands tightened around his coffee cup. I swore I'd never do that to a woman, never ask her to be less than she was just to make me feel like more. Is that why you never married? Eleanor asked softly, partly. Also because I never met anyone who made me want to try. He set down his cup and reached across the table, his hand covering hers. Until now, Eleanor's breath caught. Cade, I know it's fast, he said quickly. I know we've only known each other a few weeks, but Eleanor, I've never felt like this before. You challenge me, you surprise me, you make me want to be better than I am. When I saw that snake in your classroom, when I thought about something happening to you, he stopped, his throat working. I realized I was already halfway in love with you. Eleanor's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. Only halfway, she managed, trying for levity even as her eyes filled with tears. Cade stood, pulling her gently to her feet, his hands framing her face. Maybe more than halfway, he admitted, his voice rough. Maybe all the way. I've been trying so hard not to feel this, Eleanor whispered. Trying to be sensible, to be practical, but Cade, every time I see you, every time you smile at me, I feel like I'm standing on the edge of a cliff and I want to jump. Then jump, he said, and kissed her. It was nothing like Eleanor had imagined a kiss would be. It was better, warmer, fuller, his lips gentle but insistent against hers, his hands cradling her face like she was something precious. She felt it all the way to her toes, a warmth that spread through her entire body and made her grab the front of his shirt just to keep herself steady. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Cade rested his forehead against hers. Stay, he said. Not just for tonight, I'll take you home before it gets too late, I would never compromise you like that. But stay here in redemption. Stay and let me court you properly. Stay and see if this could be something real. I think it already is something real, Eleanor said, her hands still fisted in his shirt. I think it was real from the moment I told you that you didn't scare me. Cade laughed, pulling her close, and Eleanor rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. The sun had fully set now, and the sky was awash with stars. More stars than she'd ever seen in her life, stretching from horizon to horizon like diamonds scattered on black velvet. The courting that followed was the talk of redemption. Cade was attentive without being smothering, romantic without being foolish. He brought her flowers from the desert, bright blooms that seemed impossible in such an arid landscape. He took her riding in the early mornings before school, showing her the hidden beauty of the territory, the secret springs and ancient rock formations that took her breath away. He sat in on her classes sometimes, and she loved watching him interact with the children, patient and kind, never talking down to them, but it wasn't all easy. In mid-October, trouble came to redemption in the form of Jack Riley and his gang. They rode into town on a Tuesday morning, 6 hard-looking men with guns on their hips and meanness in their eyes. Eleanor was walking to the general store when they rode past, and something about the way Jack Riley looked at her, his gaze sliding over her like oil, made her skin crawl. That's a pretty little thing, Riley said to his men, loud enough for Eleanor to hear. Wonder if she's as refined as she looks. Eleanor kept walking, her back straight, refusing to show fear even as her heart raced. She made it to the store and was trying to catch her breath when Cade appeared, his face dark with fury. "Stay inside," he said tersely. "Don't come out until I come get you." "What's happening?" Eleanor grabbed his arm. "Cade, who are those men?" "Trouble." Jack Riley runs with a gang of rustlers and thieves. They've been operating in the territory for months and the law hasn't been able to catch them. His jaw was tight. "I need to go talk to the sheriff. Just stay here, please." Eleanor watched through the store window as Cade strode down the street to the sheriff's office. Riley and his men were lounging outside the saloon, watching everyone who passed with predatory interest. She had a bad feeling about this, a cold certainty that something terrible was about to happen. The confrontation came 2 hours later. Riley and his men tried to rob the bank, but the sheriff had been waiting with a group of armed men, Cade among them. The gunfight that erupted was brief but intense, the sound of shots echoing through the town like thunder. Eleanor huddled in the store with several other women, her hands pressed over her mouth, praying desperately that Cade would be all right. When the shooting finally stopped, the silence was deafening. Eleanor pushed out of the store, running toward the bank despite the shopkeeper's protests. She saw bodies in the street, saw blood soaking into the dust, and her heart stopped. Then she saw Cade, standing with the sheriff, unhurt except for a graze on his arm that was bleeding sluggishly. Their eyes met across the distance, and Eleanor picked up her skirts and ran. She didn't care who was watching, didn't care about propriety or scandal. She ran straight into his arms and he caught her, holding her tight against him. "I'm all right," he murmured into her hair. "I'm all right, Eleanor." "I thought when I heard the shooting," she couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't articulate the sheer terror that had gripped her. "I know. I'm sorry." He pulled back just enough to look at her face, his thumb wiping away tears she hadn't realized she was crying. "I'm so sorry you had to be afraid, Mr. Morrow," the sheriff said, clearing his throat. "We should get you to the doctor, get that arm looked at." Eleanor insisted on going with him, holding his other hand while the doctor cleaned and bandaged the wound. It was minor, just a graze like Cade had said, but seeing his blood had made everything feel suddenly, starkly real. Life out here was dangerous in ways that Boston had never been. People died, people she could come to care about, people she already did care about. "You're thinking too hard," Cade said softly. The doctor had left them alone in the examination room and Cade was watching her face. "I can see it in your eyes." "I'm thinking about how easily I could have lost you today," Eleanor admitted. "How this entire territory is dangerous and unpredictable, and how I've let myself fall in love with you anyway." Cade's eyes widened. "Say that again." "Which part?" "The part where you've fallen in love with me." His voice was rough, hopeful, and Eleanor felt her heart expand in her chest. "I've fallen in love with you, Cade Morrow," she said clearly. "Completely, terrifyingly in love with you." He pulled her to him with his good arm, kissing her with a desperation that matched her own. "Marry me," he said against her lips. "I know it's fast, I know I should wait and do this properly, but Eleanor, marry me. Be my wife, build a life with me out here. I'll do everything in my power to keep you safe, to make you happy, to be worthy of you." Eleanor pulled back, her hands framing his face, looking into those whiskey-colored eyes that had become so dear to her. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you." The wedding took place 3 weeks later in the small church where Eleanor taught her classes. It seemed fitting somehow, bringing together the two parts of her life in redemption. Eleanor wore a dress of ivory silk that she'd ordered from a catalog, simple but elegant, with a high collar and pearl buttons. Cade wore a new suit that made him look uncomfortable and devastatingly handsome all at once. The whole town turned out for the ceremony. Eleanor's students sat in the front pews, the girls sighing over the romance of it all, the boys squirming in their Sunday best. The minister was long-winded, droning on about duty and commitment, but Eleanor barely heard him. She was too focused on Cade, on the way he was looking at her like she was the only person in the world, like she was something miraculous. When the minister finally pronounced them husband and wife, Cade kissed her with a tenderness that made Eleanor's eyes sting with tears. The church erupted in applause, and Eleanor laughed against his mouth, joy bubbling up inside her like champagne. The reception was held in the street outside the church, tables set up with food that everyone in town had contributed to. There was music, a fiddle player and someone with a guitar, and Cade swept Eleanor into a dance even though she protested that she was terrible at it. He just laughed and held her close, guiding her through the steps, and Eleanor thought she'd never been happier in her entire life. As the sun set and the stars came out, Cade finally drew her away from the celebration, leading her to his horse. Their horse now, Eleanor supposed. Everything was theirs now, shared and combined for better or worse. The ride to the ranch felt different this time, weighted with anticipation and a nervousness that Eleanor hadn't expected. She was a modern woman, educated and forward-thinking, but she was also entirely innocent, her knowledge of what happened between husbands and wives more theoretical than practical. Cade seemed to sense her nervousness. As they rode, he talked about his plans for the ranch, about how he wanted to expand the horse breeding operation, about a new irrigation system he'd read about that might make it possible to grow more crops. It was his way of putting her at ease, Eleanor realized, giving her time to adjust to this new reality. When they arrived at the ranch, Cade helped her down from the horse and then, to her surprise, swept her up into his arms. "Tradition," he said with a grin, carrying her over the threshold of the house. "Can't have people saying I didn't do this properly." He set her down gently in the bedroom, and Eleanor's nervousness came flooding back. The room was simple but clean, the bed covered with a quilt that looked handmade, probably by some woman in town. There were candles burning, casting warm light over everything, and Eleanor wondered if Cade had arranged that before the wedding or if one of his ranch hands had done it. "Eleanor," Cade said softly, turning her to face him, "we don't have to do anything tonight, we have the rest of our lives, there's no rush." "I want to," Eleanor said, surprised to find it was true. "I'm just nervous, I don't really know what to expect." Cade's smile was gentle. "I'll show you," he said. "And if anything scares you or hurts you or doesn't feel right, you tell me and we stop, all right?" Eleanor nodded, and Cade kissed her, soft and sweet and slowly deepening until she felt that warmth spreading through her again. That feeling of standing on the edge of a cliff and choosing to jump. His hands were careful, reverent almost, as he helped her out of her wedding dress, and when she stood before him in just her chemise, blushing furiously, he looked at her like she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. "You're perfect," he whispered, and proceeded to show her just how perfect he thought she was. Later, much later, Eleanor lay in Cade's arms, her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat slow to a steady rhythm. She felt transformed, like she'd shed some old version of herself and emerged as someone new, someone braver and more complete. Cade's hand was stroking her hair, gentle and soothing, and Eleanor had never felt more at peace. "No regrets?" Cade asked quietly. Eleanor propped herself up on her elbow, looking down at him. "Not a single one, I regret that I didn't meet you sooner," he said. "That's about it." He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "I love you, Eleanor Morrow." Hearing her new name sent a thrill through Eleanor that she hadn't expected. "I love you too," she said, and kissed him, slow and sweet and full of promise. The first months of marriage were an adjustment. Eleanor continued teaching, though now she made the ride from the ranch to town each day, sometimes with Cade, sometimes alone. She'd worried that marriage might change how people saw her as a teacher, might make them take her less seriously, but if anything, her students seemed more engaged than ever, perhaps sensing her increased happiness. Cade was everything Eleanor could have hoped for in a husband. He was supportive of her teaching, never once suggesting she should give it up. He was affectionate without being demanding, strong without being domineering. They talked for hours in the evenings, about everything and nothing, and Eleanor discovered that she genuinely liked her husband as much as she loved him, but there were challenges too. The ranch work was grueling. especially during calving season, and there were nights when Cade came home exhausted, barely able to eat before falling into bed. Eleanor did what she could to help, learning to cook meals that could sit for hours without spoiling, learning the basics of ranch management so she could help with the books and correspondence. In early spring, drought hit the territory. The water sources Cade's cattle depended on began to dry up, and Eleanor watched her husband grow increasingly worried. He spent long days riding the property, trying to find new sources of water, working himself to exhaustion. One of his ranch hands quit, taking a job further north where the drought wasn't as severe, and Cade had to pick up the slack. Eleanor found him one night in the barn, staring at a map of the ranch spread out before him, his face haggard with stress. She approached quietly, wrapping her arms around him from behind, resting her cheek against his back. "Tell me what I can do to help," she said simply. Cade turned in her arms, and Eleanor was shocked to see tears in his eyes. "I don't know if there's anything anyone can do," he admitted. "If the drought doesn't break soon, I'm going to lose cattle, maybe lose the ranch entirely." "That won't happen," Eleanor said fiercely. "We'll figure something out, we'll get through this together," and they did. Eleanor used some of her savings to hire another ranch hand. She organized the women in town to collect and deliver water to the most desperate ranches in the area, Cade's included. She taught evening classes to earn extra money, and when the town council proposed cutting her salary, she argued them into keeping it the same by pointing out that their children deserved stability in their education, drought or no drought. The rains finally came in late May, blessed and soaking, turning the parched landscape green almost overnight. Cade stood on the porch of their ranch house, his face tilted up to the sky, water streaming down his cheeks, and laughed with pure relief. Eleanor joined him, letting the rain soak through her clothes, not caring about anything except the fact that they'd survived, they'd made it through together. That night, as they lay tangled together in their bed, Cade pulled her close and said, "I couldn't have done this without you. You know that, right? You saved this ranch as much as the rain did." "We're partners," Eleanor said simply. "That's what marriage means." Summer came, hot and bright, and with it came news that changed everything. Eleanor had been feeling unwell for several weeks, tired and nauseous, and when the doctor confirmed what she'd already begun to suspect, she felt a complicated mixture of joy and terror. She was going to be a mother. She and Cade were going to have a baby. She told him that evening after dinner when they were sitting on the porch watching the sun set. She'd planned a whole speech about it, but in the end, she just blurted it out. "I'm pregnant." Cade went very still. Then he turned to her, his eyes wide, searching her face. "You're sure?" "The doctor confirmed it this afternoon. I'm about 3 months along, he thinks. The baby should come in January." Cade let out a whoop of joy that startled the horses in the corral. He swept Eleanor up into his arms, spinning her around, kissing her with such enthusiasm that she started laughing. When he finally set her down, his hands were shaking as they rested on her still flat stomach. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "We're going to have a baby. Are you happy?" Eleanor asked, suddenly nervous. "Happy?" Cade's eyes were suspiciously bright. "Eleanor, I don't have words for what I am. Terrified, thrilled, grateful, all of it at once." He pulled her close. "I promise you I'm going to be a good father. I'm going to be there for this child for you, always." Eleanor believed him. Over the following months, as her body changed and grew, Cade was there for everything. He insisted she stop riding to town once she started showing, arranging for her to stay with the minister and his wife during the school week, and coming to get her on weekends. He read every book about childbirth and infant care that Eleanor could find, his brow furrowed with concentration. He built a cradle with his own hands, spending hours sanding and finishing the wood until it was smooth and perfect. The baby came on a cold January night in 1880, arriving 3 weeks early and in a hurry. Cade rode through a snowstorm to fetch the midwife, then paced the hallway while Eleanor labored, his boots wearing a path in the floorboards. When the baby finally arrived, when Eleanor's exhausted cries gave way to an infant's wail, Cade burst into the room despite the midwife's protests. "A boy," the midwife announced, wrapping the baby in a clean cloth. "A healthy baby boy." Cade approached the bed slowly, reverently, his eyes fixed on the tiny bundle in Eleanor's arms. She was exhausted, sweat-soaked and pale, but she'd never looked more beautiful to him. She looked up, meeting his eyes, and smiled. "Would you like to hold your son?" she asked. Cade's hands were shaking as he took the baby, cradling him against his chest with a care that made Eleanor's heart squeeze. The baby was tiny, wrinkled, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that would probably turn brown like his father's. He'd stopped crying when Cade picked him up, seeming to recognize his father's voice from all those nights when Cade had talked to Eleanor's belly, telling their unborn child stories about the ranch and the horses and how much they were already loved. "Hello, son," Cade whispered, his voice rough. "I'm your father, and I'm going to do everything in my power to make you proud of me." They named him James after Eleanor's father, with Cade's surname of Morrow. He was a good baby, fussy but not colicky, and Eleanor discovered that she loved being a mother in ways she'd never expected. She took the rest of the school year off, and the town hired a temporary teacher, but Eleanor found she didn't miss it as much as she'd thought she would. She was too busy with James, with learning his rhythms and needs, with marveling at every tiny milestone. Cade was a devoted father. He carved toys for James, sang to him in a rumbling voice that seemed to soothe the baby instantly, changed diapers without complaint. Eleanor would sometimes watch them together, her rough cowboy husband and their tiny son, and feel so full of love she thought she might burst with it. Spring came again, and with it came decisions. The temporary teacher had accepted a position in California, and the town council asked if Eleanor would return to teaching. She looked at James, now 4 months old and starting to smile and babble, and felt torn. She loved teaching, loved the feeling of shaping young minds and making a difference. But she also loved being home with her son, loved these quiet days at the ranch. "What do you want to do?" Cade asked when she brought it up to him. "I don't know," Eleanor admitted. "I feel like whatever I choose, I'll be giving something up." Cade was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What if we hired someone to help? Maria, my ranch hand, Hosea's wife, mentioned she was looking for work. She could come during the day, help with James and the house, and you could teach a few days a week. Not full-time, but enough that you're still making a difference." It was a perfect solution. Maria proved to be wonderful with James, patient and loving, and Eleanor returned to teaching 3 days a week. It was the best of both worlds, allowing her to maintain her career while still being present for her son. The arrangement worked so well that when Eleanor discovered she was pregnant again in the fall of 1881, she knew she could make it work with 2 children. Their daughter, Sarah, was born in May of 1882, arriving during a thunderstorm that lit up the sky with purple lightning. She had Eleanor's green eyes and Cade's stubborn chin, and she was beautiful and fierce from the moment she drew her first breath. James, now 2.5, was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to touch her constantly, to bring her his toys, to help in any way his toddler hands could manage. Life settled into a new rhythm, busier and more chaotic but also richer. The ranch continued to thrive, and Cade took on a partner, his most trusted ranch hand, Jose, giving Cade more time to spend with his family. Eleanor taught her 3 days a week, wrote lesson plans and graded papers in the evenings while Cade wrangled the children, and felt more fulfilled than she ever had in Boston. But the greatest test of their marriage came in the summer of 1883. Cade's brother, Samuel, arrived from Virginia, bringing with him news that their mother was dying and wanted to see Cade one last time. Samuel was everything Cade was not, polished and refined and full of airs, looking down his nose at the ranch, at redemption, at the life Cade had built. "You could come back to Virginia," Samuel said over dinner that first night. "Father left you a portion of the estate in his will. It's not too late to reclaim your place in society." Cade's jaw tightened. This is my place. This ranch, this town, this family, I'm not leaving. But what about your children? Samuel pressed. Don't you want them to have the advantages of Eastern society, proper schools, proper connections? Eleanor, who had been quiet up until this point, set down her fork with a sharp click. My children have everything they need right here. They have parents who love them, a community that supports them, and an education that will prepare them for real life, not just tea parties and social climbing. Samuel looked at her like he'd just noticed she was there. My dear, I'm sure you mean well, but you don't understand the opportunities that— I understand perfectly, Eleanor interrupted, her voice cold. I grew up in that world, Mr. Morrow. I know exactly what it offers, and I know what it costs. I chose to leave, just like your brother did, and I've never regretted it for a moment. Cade reached under the table and squeezed her hand, his eyes warm with pride and love. They made the journey to Virginia, all of them, because despite everything, Cade needed to say goodbye to his mother. The trip was long and difficult with two small children, but they managed. Cade's mother was in the final stages of consumption, wasting away in a grand bedroom in a house that reeked of old money and older prejudices. But when she saw Cade, when she met Eleanor and the children, her face lit up with genuine joy. You look happy, she whispered to Cade, her voice barely audible. Happier than I've ever seen you. I am, Mama, Cade said, his voice thick. I'm so happy. His mother turned to Eleanor, taking her hand with fingers that felt like bird bones. Thank you, she said. Thank you for loving my son, for giving him the life I always wished I could have had. She died 3 days later, peacefully in her sleep. They stayed for the funeral, endured Samuel's disapproving looks and the whispers of Virginia society, and then returned to Arizona with relief. As their train pulled away from the station, Eleanor felt Cade relax beside her, tension draining from his shoulders. Home, he said simply, and Eleanor nodded, understanding completely. The years that followed were full and rich. James grew into a thoughtful boy who loved horses and books in equal measure. Sarah was all fire and determination, declaring at age 5 that she was going to be a rancher like her father and a teacher like her mother, and Eleanor believed her. In 1886, they had another son, Thomas, who was quiet and observant, content to sit and watch the world rather than constantly engaging with it like his siblings. Eleanor's teaching evolved over the years. She began offering evening classes for adults who wanted to learn to read, and she was surprised and touched by how many people took her up on it. She saw hardened cowboys struggling with their letters, immigrant workers determined to master English, women who'd never had the opportunity for education seizing it with both hands. It was some of the most rewarding work she'd ever done. Cade's ranch became one of the most successful in the territory. His horses were known throughout Arizona and beyond for their quality, and he was often called upon to advise other ranchers. He never forgot his principles, paying his workers fair wages and treating everyone with respect regardless of their background. When Arizona became a state in 1912, Cade was asked to run for the state legislature, but he declined. He was a rancher, he said, not a politician. Their love deepened over the years in ways Eleanor never could have anticipated. It wasn't the passionate, all-consuming fire of their courtship, though that spark never fully died. Instead, it became something deeper, steadier, a foundation upon which everything else in their lives was built. They knew each other's rhythms, could communicate with a glance, could make each other laugh even in the darkest times. There were hard times too. They lost a pregnancy in 1888, and Eleanor grieved deeply for the child who never was. One of their ranch hands was killed in an accident with a spooked horse, and Cade blamed himself for months, becoming withdrawn and haunted. James broke his arm falling from a tree and developed a fever that terrified them both before it finally broke. Sarah ran away at age 12 after an argument, and they spent a frantic night searching before finding her asleep in the barn, tear-stained and repentant. But through all of it, they had each other. When Eleanor grieved, Cade held her and let her cry. When Cade struggled, Eleanor was there to remind him of his strength and goodness. When the children pushed boundaries and tested limits, they presented a united front, supporting each other's decisions and backing each other up. Time moved on, as it always does. James left for university in 1898, determined to study veterinary medicine so he could come back and help his father with the ranch. Sarah, true to her word, stayed and learned every aspect of ranching, becoming as skilled as any of the ranch hands and twice as determined. Thomas surprised them all by showing an aptitude for business, taking over the financial side of the ranch and implementing improvements that increased their profits considerably. Eleanor retired from teaching in 1905, at the age of 49, after 27 years in the classroom. The town threw her a celebration, and former students came from all over the territory to honor her. Some were parents themselves now, bringing their children to meet the teacher who had changed their lives. Eleanor was moved to tears by the outpouring of love and gratitude. "You made a difference," Cade said that night as they lay in bed, his arms around her. "You changed this town, changed hundreds of lives. You should be so proud." "I am," Eleanor said, "but I'm most proud of us, of what we built together." Their golden anniversary came in 1929, and their children organized a massive celebration. James had returned to the ranch after university, bringing with him a wife and 3 children of their own. Sarah had married one of the ranch hands, a good man who respected her fierce independence, and they had 2 daughters who were just as strong-willed as their mother. Thomas had moved to Phoenix to pursue business opportunities, but visited frequently with his wife and son. The party was held at the ranch, with what seemed like half the territory in attendance. There were grandchildren running everywhere, music and dancing, enough food to feed an army. Eleanor stood on the porch of the house Cade had built all those years ago, watching the celebration, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. Cade found her there, slipping his arms around her waist from behind just as she'd done to him so many times over the years. They were both older now, grayer, with lines on their faces and aches in their joints, but Eleanor still felt that flutter in her stomach when he touched her, still felt like that young woman who'd stepped off the stagecoach in Redemption all those years ago. "What are you thinking about?" Cade asked, his breath warm against her ear. "About how lucky I am," Eleanor said. "About how different my life would have been if I'd never come west, if I'd never met you." "I'm the lucky one," Cade said. "From the moment you told me I didn't scare you, I knew you were going to change my life. I just didn't know how much." Eleanor turned in his arms, looking up at the man she'd loved for 50 years, the man who'd been her partner, her best friend, her great love. "Do I scare you now?" she asked, teasing. Cade pretended to consider it. "Terrify me," he said solemnly. "But I wouldn't have it any other way." Then he kissed her, soft and sweet and full of 50 years of love and commitment and shared history, and Eleanor knew that every choice she'd made, every risk she'd taken had been worth it for this moment, for this man, for this life they'd built together. As the sun set over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in those impossible colors that still took Eleanor's breath away after all these years, she and Cade rejoined their family. They danced together, surrounded by their children and grandchildren, surrounded by the community they'd helped build, surrounded by love. And Eleanor thought that if she could go back and tell her younger self, that terrified 22-year-old stepping off the stagecoach into an unknown future, she would tell her to be brave, to take the leap, to trust that love and courage could build something beautiful even in the hardest places. She would tell her that the cowboy who seemed so intimidating at first would become the great love of her life, that the dusty frontier town would become home, that the life she was so afraid of would exceed her wildest dreams. She would tell her that saying, "You don't scare me," to Cade Morrow would be the bravest and best thing she ever did, and that his response, "Good, that means I stay," would be a promise kept every single day for the rest of their lives. And as the stars came out overhead, as numerous and bright as they'd been on that first night when Cade kissed her on his porch, Eleanor held tight to her husband's hand, and gave thanks for every moment of their extraordinary, ordinary, perfectly imperfect life together in the Wild West they'd both come to love.